Thank you so much, Dr. Cook, and thank you all for being here today. So in Sweden, the approach to work with children growing up in families affiliated with violent extremism interlinks with the ordinary Swedish welfare system, where the public sector and the municipal social services agencies, including child protection units, would be responsible to assess and also work on these cases if the child is considered to be at risk. And the strength with this approach is that it offers a range of social programs, and there's a lot of support mechanisms within the Swedish society. However, the limitations with this approach is that there's often a lack of contextual understanding, as we just heard Josh talking about, of the child's situation and specific needs that would adhere coming from living in the environment of violent extremism. And this would result in that the programs for the children and the assessments and interventions for the children and the family wouldn't be so accurate at all times, not so spot on. And here I think it's important to bear in mind the do no harm principle when assessing the work with these families. And I want to take the specific case of children of parents who traveled to Syria and Iraq and lived under ISIS rule as an example, and how Sweden has handled this case. Initially, the Swedish government were reluctant to do anything to deal with this issue, basically leaving children stranded in Al-Hol and Rosh camp. After a major struggle from their grandfather, Patricio Galvez, he managed to convince the Swedish government that he should be able to bring his 7 orphaned grandchildren back home to Sweden from Al-Hol, and this occurred in May 2019. But after that, the Swedish government lingered almost 2.5 years before the next repatriations would take place. And through this perspective, Sweden could have enabled a safe environment for children at deep risk, but choose to let them remain in a high-threat environment for several years, although it was known that the children were staying in camps where there were a range of people living populated in a very small area, including ISIS sympathizers within these closed camps that could potentially have a negative impact on the children. And here I think it's important to note how the mothers of children have played a significant role in protecting children from being influenced and impacted by the violent ideology when the society and government did actually not protect them. But after a policy change, the Swedish government did start repatriating remaining children along with their mothers. So it's been in 5 instances that Sweden brought home 12 women and 23 children between September 21 and May 22. And when the families arrived back in Sweden, initially they were met by multiple authorities. Children and mothers were separated from each other. The mothers were taken into police custody to be questioned, while the children were taken into social services custody. And these separations at the airport occurred in a very dramatic way, where children were screaming and crying. One child threw up from the fear, and he expressed he was afraid that his mother would never be able to find him again. All children ranging in age from 3 to 10 when returned responded to these separations with anxiety and symptoms of depression. And the mothers were detained only for 1 day before they were released, though in all but one case, it took up to weeks or months, up to 6 months in one case, before they were reunited. Still, there is a couple of cases where the children and mother are still not reunited, even though the mothers are not suspected for any crime. In Sweden, we didn't have laws neither to prevent people from traveling there, nor to, by default, prosecute them coming back. And also, mothers are fully distancing themselves from ISIS or any violent ideology. And the reason for this very varying treatment of the children is that there has not been a national approach, but rather that every municipality in Sweden decides over their own municipal citizens, and all families come from different locations. So that means that every child has been assessed and put in programs according to the politics and the assessments done in that specific municipality. And a lesson learned here for receiving authorities, I think, is that when the children arrive back in the country, everything is new to them. It becomes like a crisis-like experience as they are thrust into a new reality. And as the children firstly have suffered in the war, in the so-called caliphate, and more recently in the prison camps in northeast Syria, we've analyzed that part of the process of resettlement back in Sweden has been cause of further trauma for the children, and there has been practices from authorities that have caused delays in the reintegration and recovery process for the children. Because if a child is separated from its caregiver, from its only source of safety actually, there is an increased risk of reinforcing the child's trauma and spurring more anxiety and insecurity. Then obviously if the child would be at a true risk remaining with the mother, the child needs to be protected. That goes without saying, I think. We have learned that a multi-agency collaboration between relevant authorities and civil society organizations, including faith communities, with a contextual understanding is a component to successfully plan and implement a holistic approach to assess and meet the needs of the families and to prevent further radicalization. And this would include contributing to the families' access to support aimed at empowering their emotional, their social, psychological, and in this case also theological resilience. We have also noted that the reintegration and rehabilitation have a higher likelihood of success when there is a holistic approach that fully accounts for the child's well-being and development, and where the repatriated individuals, their extended family members, and other key persons in the child's life are included in the planning, people that will remain in the child's life long after the professionals have finished their programs. And such involvement would keep families together, avoid new separations, create stability for the child, and would promote a favorable psychological recovery. Something that has been truly valuable for the children in this process is to let them start preschool and school as soon as possible, for them to have another arena for development, normality, and social activities. Lastly, I want to conclude to say that it's going well for the children. And their mothers, actually. As a social worker within Repatriate the Children, I go visit these families. I'm in regular contact with them. Just last week, I was traveling around Sweden doing visits with 6 of the returning families. And it's just incredible to see and follow their development and how they are adapting, how they are recovering. As one relative of returning children recently reflected on their situation, he said, "It's almost like the children are trying to catch up with everything they have missed. Now they have gotten a new chance in life and they are surely embracing it." Thank you.
Good afternoon in this, I think. So my name is Yanthe Gunther. I work at the Youth Protection. I will use the English name or the English translation because the Dutch word is really not pronounceable in English. So I'm going to tell you something about the Dutch approach for the returnee children. So in the Netherlands, we are the national body to supervise all the returnee children across the country. So the Netherlands has chosen to centralize this. We have about 75 returnee children at this moment and about 25 mothers. and all the 25 mothers are detained at this moment. Well, minus one, she has been suspended from detention. However, most of the women that have been returned are detained. So the majority of the children that were repatriated by the government were repatriated due to a court order, so that the mothers could join their own trial. So this was actually the reason why the Netherlands repatriated these children from Syria and these mothers. They are all being suspected for joining a terrorist organization, so that's why they were detained right away. There is a difference. We have children that were repatriated in a large group, and there are also a couple of children returned that were that went to the consulate, but the mothers with the children to the consulate, and they could come back that way to the Netherlands. But most of them were repatriated in a big group. Which meant for the children that the group came back at the airport with a flight. The last one we had was a big flight with 12 women, 28 children. And since the women were detained right away, we had a really traumatic repatriation, because at the airport the children were separated from their mothers, which you all can imagine was very chaotic, a lot of tears, a lot of chaos. So for all these children, this is of course very traumatic experience and a breach in the attachment with their mothers, because they're arriving in a country which they don't know, and the only person who is really who should be there for them is the person that will be kept away from them. What we saw with these children was that they were really anxious. A couple of them didn't speak the Dutch language. Not all of us speak the Arabic language, so it was really traumatic to help these children. What happened to these children in the Netherlands? We started the National Advisory Board for minor returnees, and in this board or this team there were specialists like psychologists, like foster care was in it, behavioral scientists, district attorneys, and this specialized team was set up to monitor these children. What we did, for instance, was placing these children directly at Family Network. There were investigations about these families, whether they were capable, and that was how we started these cases. However, at the moment we did that, sorry, kind of lost for words. We used to do that, but we saw that it really didn't work out, because these children were really acting out in behavior, and they were really, it was very hard for the family members to deal with these children, because they were acting out so much, they were really traumatized. These families had an emotional bond with these children. They just wanted to cuddle these children and just wanted to be warm and loving, but not being able to give them the boundaries that children also do need. So they, it just didn't go very well. It collapsed, and then they couldn't take care of these children anymore, which made that we made a decision to put them in a 3-month observation. So professional caregivers or professional social workers could work with these children, could see what these children needed, and the National Advisory Team would send screeners to see what these children needed, and then we could come together and see, okay, who is this child, what does this child need, and what does it need from a caregiver, and how can we help a potential caregiver to give the child what's needed. let's see. So these children were in this observation group for 3 months, and just also to stabilize, because everything in our country was new for these children. A warm shower, a heating system, sliding doors, but also a plane flying over, which is pretty normal for us. Well, for these children, it really was very scary. They just flew and ducked under tables or couches or whatever they could find. So meanwhile, in these 3 months, the family members that were an option for to raise these children during the detention of the mothers were screened and see if it was compatible, so if these caregivers could meet the needs of these children. So depending on the outcome of the screening of both the children and the possible families, the children were either placed with families or they were placed in foster care or group care. And well, that differs per family. What we do see with the children, with all of the children actually, is that they have a lot of trauma. They went to war zones, they've seen violence, they've seen militaries, they have seen a lot of things. We see a lot of attachment problems, because even though these children were with their mothers 24/7, they were. That doesn't mean that the attachment went very well, because they to have a good attachment with your mother or your caregiver, you need to have the opportunity to explore and the opportunity to fall back on your caregiver if something goes wrong. And in this case, they hadn't have the opportunity to explore, but they couldn't fall back on their mother as well when something went wrong. When there wasn't bombing, there was also stress with the mother, so the mother couldn't regulate the stress of the child. So we see a lot of problems in that. We see sometimes with the older children, we see the identity problems, and of course the cognitive disadvantage due to the lack of education, or sometimes also due to trauma. We have a lot of challenges working with these children. First of all, clarifying the trauma. That's actually due to the mothers who are still in prison, and these mothers are scared to be open about what happened, because everything they say can be used, well, they think that it can be used in their trial, can be used against them. So they will not tell a lot about what the children really went through. There are a lot of waiting lists in the Netherlands for help, so that's also a very big challenge. We need to take account for the cultural aspects, which is sometimes difficult. Sometimes language is a difficulty, because there are not that many Arabic speaking, and Arabic speaking is also very broad, but social workers. The detention of the mothers is a really big challenge, because these mothers are detained, which makes meeting them complicated, which makes talking to them in combination with family members or in combination with help or caregivers very difficult. And what is really a difficult thing and a challenge is that the Netherlands is revoking a Dutch nationality if the mother has a double nationality, and unfortunately in most cases this is the case. So at this moment we are having mothers whose nationality has been revoked, which means you do not have the right to social security, homes, jobs, schooling, which makes it very difficult to place these children back with their mothers. However, the children do have the Dutch nationality, so they do have certain rights, but in practice it's very complicated to see that the children will get these rights when they're living with their mother. So that is really one of the most most difficult topics at this moment, actually. I think that's what we do in the Netherlands for now. So I will pass the mic on to my neighbor.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. I am Vebi Mujku, Director of Center for Social Work in Pristina, and I can speak today on behalf of perspective of providing the social services. Center for Social Work is a local institution, and in Kosovo there are 38 of them, which means every municipality has one Center for Social Work. Really, we have a lot of information to share with you, but I can be focused only on work, what we do within our institution, which is public institution, and responsibility for providing the services for all citizens. We have a different type of clients, because we name the clients, and in our institution we have like 74 types of clients which are receiving services, social service within a center. Now, talking for repatriated people, I will be focused mostly on these topics because we are today here for this topic. We intervene from the first moment. Whenever you have a case of repatriation, we are there the first to provide the services for the children, for the woman, for all the family. And from that moment, whenever we intervene for every case, Center for Social Work is obliged to appoint a case manager, which case manager can deal with the family. In case that we have a child which are accompanied or they are orphan child because due to the missing the both parents, we can appoint immediately within a 24 hours the legal guardianship, which legal guardianship can protect their rights and everything whatever is needed for the children. As you know, Kosovo has a large number of the citizens who are part of this war. And until now, based on the data which we possess, there are 423 people, but from 2019 up to 2022, which are repatriated, but we have the largest number of repatriated people at once. We have in 2009, like 123 people returned at once, and there are 78 children, 33 women, and 12 men. And of course, the men, based in our law, they automatically they sent to the detention, but in Kosovo usually the woman didn't send to the detention because always we consider that there is a best interest of the child to stay with the children, and most of them they are under home arrested, but always under supervision of the security of the police, of the workers of Center Social Work, etc. What we provide? We provide for all these family psychosocial support because the case manager can immediately develop the individual working plan for each family and always having in consideration the best interest of the child and to see which is the need of the family. In beginning, when the family were returned, all of them, they said that we have shelter and we have when to go. But after first evaluation, became that 20 of those families didn't have any house, and we are obliged to pay rent, and still we continue paying the rent for those families. We have like 50 families which are receiving the support from the state, and we pay the rent for them. But in same times, we did provide also the social sense scheme, because within the Center for Social Work also there is a division which provide this financial support to this family, and in most of the cases family is not able to complete these administrative documents which are needed to fulfill and to complete to receive this support, but always we escape some of those documents just in order to provide this financial support. But in case that we have children with no parents, always we have developed very well in Kosovo the foster care service, and we have cases when we place the children in foster care families. What else we do? We have cases when the children are not registered at all. they don't have any birth certificate, and we are also obliged within our institution to do registration of these children to the civil registration. And we have a problem with the dates, because usually it doesn't have any documents, or they do provide any documents in Arabic, which really we cannot recognize, because you don't understand that you cannot recognize, because if you recognize this document, means that we recognize also the war of the ISIS. And we take a date when the mother can show, which is approximately date. For every case, in every municipality, we did organize this case management roundtable. We organize the work when they are multidisciplinary work. They participate all actors which are within the municipality, and we discuss by name there for the family. Every institution can show what they did, which are the obligations which they received, did they fulfill, and this is in a monthly basis we organize. If it's needed, we can organize much often such meetings just to see where we achieved. Because the problem is for some of the children who went to the schools and they are 9 years old, we cannot send them to the first class. For them, we organize the schools, and they can to follow up on the schools, and they do finish 2 graduation within 1 year in order to achieve other plans. Some of them didn't, they have problem with language barriers. We organize some courses for them. And of course that we have a problem with some of the children, because we have a mother who came with 2-3 children, and they have those children from 3 husbands, because the first one died in the war. They get married for the second time, for the third time, and also we need to work also with those family to make some of them, they are also a different color. What else we do? We were working closely with NGOs. We have some NGOs who are quite professional in this area, especially with providing the psychological services, because usually in a state institution we don't have too much or enough psychologists employed, and we are using their services to provide those services. And those services are provided directly at home, in the schools, and also we do some additional education for those children. We did organize also some study visits, study tours within Kosovo, that people can be more familiar with other cities in Kosovo, monuments, and the history of Kosovo, because we have children who are born there and they don't have any information about Kosovo. In the end, what we did, now we are in a process to develop the database, and we want to have a database to do this, to do follow-up of the cases for a long time. And every municipality will have an approach to their clients, but central level, which is Ministry of Internal Affairs, they're going to have an approach to all clients and to do follow-up, especially having consideration after some psychological session that we need to take care on children who will be adult very soon, and to not become maybe a recidivist, or to become a member of ISIS in the future, especially from those children who lost their fathers in a war. This is what really we are focused to work on, mostly on those children. I don't know what else. Maybe I can receive any question from you, and I'll be able to answer during the session. But maybe one of the information is very important. From all these people who are repatriated until now in Kosovo, we had only one case who is a recidivist. And this out of the program, because when I talked for 123 people, they came with a program which organized by state, but this person is out of the program, and it's only one case this year who are recidivists, and this is very good news for us, for all of us. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much all for listening, and I'm going to shift gear a little bit, not talking so much from a practitioner perspective, although I have been working in Uzbekistan with practitioners about how they are repatriating some 500 families, and that's over 1,000 individuals, so it's a slightly different scale, but still very pertinent. But what I'd like to talk to you about is actually to bring home some of the identity factors that we might wish to take into consideration when we look at the repatriation, rehabilitation and reintegration processes for children. I think internationally there are some tensions that have still not yet been resolved about how we respond to children returning from conflict zones, and whether we see them just generically as vulnerable categories. Right? These are just vulnerable children, and they should be therefore just treated within our regular social working processes and so on. But this does come with its challenges because, as has already been said, the context and the unique traumas that these children have experienced is often hidden under this generic category of vulnerable children. But the other categories that get hidden in the way that we discuss and the way we frame our rehabilitation and reintegration programs are those of gender, race, and age. Most of my work is about focusing on issues of gender, but I think here we need to be really mindful as well of issues of age and race. The first reason for this is that understanding these identity factors helps us understand the experiences of the children while they're in the conflict zone. We tend to think of the children as a homogeneous block, and then individuals, right, as, oh, we do a case-by-case basis. But this can be problematic if we only have these two kind of poles to work within, because actually we don't necessarily fund the right kinds of resources or processes necessary, especially when looking at issues of gender and race. We've already heard, for example, that there aren't necessarily enough practitioners who can speak the relevant dialects in Iraq and Syria that the children themselves speak. This is an issue about ourselves. But we also know that many of our theories about trauma are informed by men's experiences, not women's and girls'. This can often mean that women and girls, that they don't present in a way that we recognize, right? They don't act out in the way that is expected. The mothers may in fact present as very well-adjusted individuals because they are so focused on ensuring their children are not taken away from them. The girls, for example, may not actually feel comfortable talking in public spaces, may not actually present their trauma in a way that we are conditioned to expect because of the way we are trained in our own professions. So in fact, it brings up an understanding of the experiences of the children, boys and girls, as they are repatriated, as they are rehabilitated and reintegrated into our societies. It tells us about ourselves as well as about them. But also their experiences within the conflict zone vary according to age and gender as well as race, right? ISIS have put forward a very dominant narrative that they didn't care about race. It's really not true. They cared a lot. And the experiences of your color and how closely affiliated you were to the Middle East mattered in how much treatment, how well treated you were, what support your family got within the conflict zones of Iraq and Syria. But also age really matters, right? As well as gender. We tend to think about the bonds, and I thought it was really refreshing to hear that actually some of the bonds between mothers and children are not as we might imagine them to be. For young boys, many of them were separated from their mothers through the conflict zone. They were separated either forcefully through ISIS or through trying to run away, being captured and smuggled, being re-traumatized in the detention camps, and being expected also to hold roles of adulthood, to be the breadwinner, to be the leader of the family, not to be a child. Their experiences are quite different to some of the younger girls, for example, who never went to school, who were incredibly attached to their mothers, who were being trained in very isolated ways. But this doesn't mean they didn't experience trauma, right? It's a different kind of trauma. But also, that question of age as well as gender really reflects on us as well, because we need to ask the very pertinent question about why it is that we are much more willing to repatriate, rehabilitate, and reintegrate young children, but teenage boys in particular, especially those on the cusp of adulthood, are being left in the detention centers because we presume that they are necessarily risky because of our stereotypes about young boys. So it's also reflecting on our society's assumptions about deviancy and risky behavior in young boys, but it's magnified because they're seen only through that risky lens. So understanding gender helps understand the children, but also helps us understand our response and who we are in delivering that response. The issue of race and understanding that response, I would also point out, is a problem where we separate the children, but also the assumption that the mothers can always act in the best interest of the children. There's a conflict there as well that we need to work through. But for those children where we do think about separation, are there sufficient numbers of foster families or families who are willing to adopt children? Are the extended families able to adopt children who have similar racial and ethnic backgrounds of those children? We know in many European countries that they are often have harder journeys being authorized to become foster parents, and we need to really reflect on that as a society as part of these programs. And this is my final point, that we tend to think of rehabilitation, reintegration of children from conflict zones and of their parents in some countries in isolation to the wider countering and preventing violent extremism. Now, I recognize the word prevent in the UK context is a toxic word, and that's very UK specific, I realize that. But we need to think about how are the societies themselves, the communities, able to respond and facilitate the long-term reintegration and rehabilitation of those families and children. What support are we giving them so that they do not fear the state and its surveillance, so that they have the skills and the resilience, and so that they don't also feel threatened by those families and the children, and also so that they don't begrudge them the extra support that they seem to be giving. We know in some cases where the identity of the children has been revealed and they're seen to be getting extra support and extra help, and yet there are other vulnerable children who don't seem to get that, and it causes tension and friction in communities. So we cannot take this, as much as it's a great start, in isolation. It has to be taken in the round. And understanding gender, age, and race has got to be crucial to that. And looking at ourselves and how we process will also then help us understand what our measure of success is. I sometimes ask people, why do we counter terrorism? Why? It seems a really obvious question, right? Because terrorism is bad. But there is a deeper question about what is the goal? At what point do these children, the boys and girls, do they become merely Dutch or Kosovo, British? At what point do they exit the program? What are our measures for that? And are they appropriate for their age, for their experiences? And also, what is the goal for our society when we look towards that end? What kind of society do we want them exiting into? And how can we build that into our programming? And that is a broader task and possibly not one we can answer today. But unless we have a gender-aware, an age and race-aware set of goals and outcomes for our programs, in fact, I think our individual efforts will necessarily fall short. And I wanted to end on something positive, and I've realized that I've not. I blame the fact that I was up at 4 this morning getting the train. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Now and some real practical example with age and gender considerations as well. So without further ado, any questions from the audience? There we go. We're having some mic issues today.
Hello, My name is Tara Shepherd-Lonko. I'm from Canada. I'm also a former extremist and was participant in the Prepare study. I'm also a therapist that has worked to help families and divert them from violent extremism. And I'm a PhD candidate doing some research on violent extremism in North America and what are ways to build peace. So my first question is for Beatrice, if I may call you that. I really appreciate the efforts in Sweden. When I did some research in the United Kingdom, many of the NGO participants I spoke to, as well as former extremists and victims of terrorism, said it was really important to engage local politicians to really help them see returnees or formers as human, and really see what the NGOs and the child protection services and the multi-partner services were doing on the ground in order to realize that the political engagement and the political process to assist these families was really, really important, that the political systems are really important. You mentioned the municipal differences, so I was just curious how much your program tries to engage politicians to influence policy and really help humanize and better serve these families. And then Katherine, my quick question was whether you also factor in class. So in the case of my family, my siblings who had a lot of money were treated quite differently from the leader versus the individuals in my family who had less money. And when I did the UK research, the same, families were lured to ISIS through promise of a watch or a job, as well as some young people were lured because they felt really ignored by their really wealthy working parents, so they wanted to get a sense of connection through ISIS. So, sorry, those are two questions in one.
Thank you so much for the questions, really good questions actually. When it comes to the Swedish reception of these returning families, since it's interlinked with the ordinary welfare system, the welfare system is run by, there are staff professionals that are implementing the programs, but it's politicians who make decisions about it. This question has been a very highly politicized question, where children's rights and human rights have been set aside and been on the lower step, where politics have been higher up. And this is something that we have seen, for example, when the families from the Northeast Syrian camp were repatriated and they landed in Sweden, and the politicians were making points of from the family separation. It wasn't the politician for children's affairs, social affairs, that said, yeah, we have protected the children from their potentially dangerous mothers. No, it was the Minister of Justice saying, yeah, these children, these mothers are now suffering not having their children. And this is not really how it should go, right? So this is like very politicized decisions. In our organization, we have worked a lot with media, actually, with journalists to try to lift different angles, to be part of exchanging experiences. Initially, children were not only in Sweden, but globally, they were depicted as ISIS children or ISIS brides, and this kind of language and semantics, which has been very harmful and also influenced the policies and practices. So through media, we have been trying to work on a new narrative, alternative narratives, nuanced the narratives to, as we just heard, there's a range of levels when it comes to radicalization. It's also fluctuating. Radicalization is nothing static. So we've been trying to work through this perspective. We've been asking for meetings with politicians. As a non-governmental organization, we have not had access to high-level politicians, but try to work in some cases on local levels as well. Thank you.
As someone working in the UK and being British for my sins, we're kind of obsessed with class. So I tried to avoid talking about it initially. But I think one of the main differences about class is about the ability to articulate your needs and for the families to leverage and advocate on behalf of the children. So I'll talk separately about the process by which children end up in affiliated families and why they may independently be in conflict zones. But when we think about the repatriation and the rehabilitation process and the reintegration process, those who are able to articulate their needs in the language that professionals recognize are more likely to have those needs met. And that is heavily class orientated. For those families as well that can afford to pay for private additional support and care, again, this is an added advantage. But I think as well, especially in the UK at least, and I suspect in many other countries, race is also a part of this when we look at the distribution of socioeconomic indicators across race. We live in a racist world, and that factors in. So overwhelmingly, the majority of those within the lower economic groups who have traveled, sorry, the other way around, those who have traveled to ISIS, the overwhelming majority of the lower economic groups belong to minority ethnic categories as well. So you can't easily disentangle the response that they get from both the questions about how people respond to race and how they respond to class.
Thank you. That was really, really powerful, everything that everyone has said. For me, it was really important hearing kind of the real life stories of people that you're talking about, the dynamics, the difficulties, but also kind of not just from a practitioner point of view, but also kind of a child-centric point of view as well. So I'm going to just kind of throw in maybe a point that you may not kind of want to listen to. So one is around, we're talking about affiliated with violent extremism, and I'm also conscious of the fact that we've heard predominantly, in fact, all of it is around Islamist extremism, and we've only had the lens on one type of extremism. And I wonder, A, why that may be the case, and you don't need to answer it directly, that's fine. But I think also your reflection on the point of society, when we're asking for society to advocate, for example, the voices that often advocate. So for me, race is central in a lot of this, because what we see as extremism and terrorism, we have an idea of what an extremist or a terrorist looks like and feels like, because those are manifested in our reactions. So when you talk about the social worker, for example, the voice is often, again, predominantly of those individuals who are white, who would be advocating on someone else's behalf. If you had a family that you're working with who is involved in extreme right-wing terrorism, you might not have those dynamics reflected there. And again, why is this kind of, this is, you know, extremism, terrorism has been going on for years, and yet in 2023, the lens of which we're having these types of conversations, when we talk about society, when we talk about rights, what is it that we are still missing, and why is that still missing? So maybe even a question for the room as well.
Thank you so much. So with my organization specifically, we never even, we're founded only for the case of the children of parents who traveled to Syria and Iraq as a response to no one speaking up on this topic. So for me as a social worker, I never imagined myself being in direct contact with anyone, actually, any individual being there, because we started out as an advocacy organization advocating for all governments, but specifically the Swedish one, to take responsibility for all their citizens, children, women and men. After I was together with this grandfather, Patricio Galvez, that I mentioned, and I was on the ground in 2019, being there to receive the children coming out from Al-Hol and flying with them to Sweden. As a volunteer, I was taking a gap year from work after I'd been working with rehabilitation or integration with people convicted of crimes. So I had not been working in the extremist field. So as a response, we formed the organization to advocate for Sweden to become a better society. Being like there to support these and guide and help them in different ways. And therefore, when their families were returned to Sweden, it became automatically that they also needed support in the gap between what authorities could offer. So that's my answer why I'm only working on this specific, very limited group of people.
Yeah, I think for me it's the same, We do have some right-wing radicalized children, or most of them are like the 15, 16, 17-year-old. We also have a youth parole department, and most of them are in youth parole department. Like I said, youth protection is only when a court has given a child protection measurement. So there's also a voluntary social worker in front of us. So probably there are children there as well. But up until now, I do not have that much experience with the right-wing children who radicalize. Nevertheless, we do have them, and we will focus on them as well. We are also in the Netherlands, we're making a guideline, a national guideline for radicalization, which will come out somewhere in a couple of months, just to see signals, what to look for, what are protective measurements, or protective factors. So I think it's really something we should look into even more now, because the Repatriate children, they extinct, hopefully. I mean, there are a lot of children still there, but I think for the Netherlands, in short term, well, I think most of them have come back, so we'll just, again, focus now on the right wing maybe, or on otherwise radicalized.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Lynn and I'm the postdoctoral researcher on the Prepare project, and I just wanted to give a very brief insight into the research that we have done on the far right, because we have these great panelists here and they gave us a lot of insights on the life of children who are repatriated now, but we also conducted quite extensive research on what childhood looks like in right-wing extremist families, specifically in Germany. And I will talk about this loads this afternoon, everyone who's interested in this. But we actually found really interesting overlaps between some of the experiences, this instrumentalized ideological upbringing of these children, also being separated from non-violent extremist influences, and very interestingly also similar gender stereotypes in their upbringing, what their role in the group is supposed to be. And on the other hand, there are interesting differences. So if we look at the demography, and we just talked about class, for example, right? In Germany, there's a group of very elitist, military-trained right-wing extremists whose children might not be receiving the same kind of support as children from, let's say, more marginalized communities, because these are people who don't have any needs from the state. So state interference is more difficult. Therefore, there's less experience working with these children, especially if they don't show any kind of signs of radicalization themselves. So they're very interesting, specific, also class-related vulnerabilities in the far right. I just wanted to mention this to highlight that, in fact, Prepare has us covered. And yeah, if you have any questions on that, we have more time this afternoon to talk about specific findings, so just come find me at the stalls in the afternoon.
Well, we'd like to thank our panelists again for their generous and excellent contributions, and they have been instrumental in also helping shape and inform the Prepare project over the last 18 months, so we'd like to thank them for that as well. So maybe one more hand of applause for them. And we do have one more session to go before lunch, but I do want to give everyone a bit of about a 10-minute just comfort break, leg stretch. We'll come back and we'll talk specifically about the Prepare tools, and then we will also, and outputs, and then we will have lunch downstairs after that. So about a 10-minute break. We'll be back about 20 after.